Part 2, Chapter 2. It was the beginning of June, and for a whole week the weather in St. Petersburg had been magnificent. The Epanchins had a luxurious country house at Pavlovsk, and to this spot Mrs. Epanchin determined to proceed without further delay. In a couple of days all was ready, and the family had left town. A day or two after this removal to Pavlovsk, Prince Myshkin arrived in St. Petersburg by the morning train from Moscow. No one met him, but as he stepped out of the carriage, he suddenly became aware of two strangely glowing eyes fixed upon him from among the crowd that met the train. On endeavouring to rediscover the eyes and see to whom they belonged, he could find nothing to guide him. It must have been a hallucination, but the disagreeable impression remained, and without this the prince was sad and thoughtful already, and seemed to be much preoccupied. His cab took him to a small and bad hotel near the Litaynaya. Here he engaged a couple of rooms, dark and badly furnished. He washed and changed, and hurriedly left the hotel again, as though anxious to waste no time. Anyone who now saw him for the first time since he left Petersburg would judge that he had improved vastly, so far as his exterior was concerned. His clothes certainly were very different. They were more fashionable, perhaps even too much so, and anyone inclined to mockery might have found something to smile at in his appearance. But what is there that people will not smile at? The prince took a cab and drove to a street near the Nativity, where he soon discovered the house he was seeking. It was a small wooden villa, and he was struck by its attractive and clean appearance. It stood in a pleasant little garden full of flowers. The windows looking on the street were open, and the sound of a voice, reading aloud or making a speech, came through them. It rose at times to a shout, and was interrupted occasionally by bursts of laughter. Prince Myshkin entered the courtyard and ascended the steps. A cook with her sleeves turned up to the elbows opened the door. The visitor asked if Mr. Lebedev was at home. "He's in there," said she, pointing to the salon. The room had a blue wallpaper, and was well, almost pretentiously furnished, with its round table, its divan, and its bronze clock under a glass shade. There was a narrow pier glass against the wall, and a chandelier adorned with lustres hung by a bronze chain from the ceiling. When the prince entered, Lebedev was standing in the middle of the room, his back to the door. He was in his shirt-sleeves on account of the extreme heat, and he seemed to have just reached the peroration of his speech, and was impressively beating his breast. His audience consisted of a youth of about 15 years of age, with a clever face, who had a book in his hand, though he was not reading. A young lady of 20, in deep mourning, stood near him with an infant in her arms. Another girl of 13, also in black, was laughing loudly, her mouth wide open. And on the sofa lay a handsome young man, with black hair and eyes, and a suspicion of beard and whiskers. He frequently interrupted the speaker and argued with him, to the great delight of the others. "Lukian Timofeyevitch! Lukian Timofeyevitch, here's someone to see you. Look here, a gentleman to speak to you. Well, it's not my fault." And the cook turned and went away, red with anger. Lebedev started, and at sight of the prince stood like a statue for a moment. Then he moved up to him with an ingratiating smile, but stopped short again. "Prince! Excellency!" he stammered. Then suddenly he ran towards the girl with the infant, a movement so unexpected by her that she staggered and fell back. But next moment he was threatening the other child, who was standing, still laughing, in the doorway. She screamed and ran towards the kitchen. Lebedeff stamped his foot angrily. Then, seeing the prince regarding him with amazement, he murmured apologetically, "Pardon, to show respect." "You are quite wrong," began the prince. At once, in one moment." He rushed like a whirlwind from the room, and Myshkin looked inquiringly at the others. They were all laughing, and the guest joined in the chorus. "He has gone to get his coat," said the boy. "How annoying!" exclaimed the prince. "I thought... Tell me, is he..." "You think he is drunk," cried the young man on the sofa. "Not in the least. He's only had 3 or 4 small glasses, perhaps 5. But what is that? The usual thing." As the prince opened his mouth to answer, he was interrupted by the girl, whose sweet face wore an expression of absolute frankness. "He never drinks much in the morning. If you have come to talk business with him, do it now. It is the best time. He sometimes comes back drunk in the evening, but just now he passes the greater part of the evening in tears, and reads passages of Holy Scripture aloud, because our mother died 5 weeks ago." "No doubt he ran off because he did not know what to say to you," said the youth on the divan. "I bet he is trying to cheat you, and is thinking how best to do it." Just then Lebedeff returned, having put on his coat. "5 weeks," said he, wiping his eyes. "Only 5 weeks. Poor orphans." "But why wear a coat in holes," asked the girl, "when your new one is hanging behind the door? Did you not see it?" "Hold your tongue, dragonfly," he scolded. "What a plague you are!" He stamped his foot irritably, but she only laughed and answered, "Are you trying to frighten me? I'm not Tanya, you know, and I don't intend to run away. Look, you are waking Lubotchka, and she will have convulsions again. Why do you shout like that?" "Well, well, I won't again," said the master of the house, his anxiety getting the better of his temper. He went up to his daughter and looked at the child in her arms, anxiously making the sign of the cross over her 3 times. "God bless her! God bless her!" he cried with emotion. "This little creature is my daughter Lyubov," addressing the prince. "My wife Elena died at her birth, and this is my big daughter Vera, in mourning, as you see. And this, pointing to the young man on the divan. "Well, go on, never mind me," mocked the other. "Don't be afraid." "Excellency, have you read that account of the murder of the Zemarin family in the newspaper?" cried Lebedeff all of a sudden. "Yes," said Myshkin with some surprise. "Well, that is the murderer. It is he, in fact." "What do you mean?" asked the visitor. "I am speaking allegorically, of course, but he will be the murderer of a Zemarin family in the future. He is getting ready." They all laughed, and the thought crossed the prince's mind that perhaps Lebedeff was really trifling in this way because he foresaw inconvenient questions, and wanted to gain time. "He is a traitor, a conspirator!" shouted Lebedeff, who seemed to have lost all control over himself. "A monster, a slanderer! Ought I to treat him as a nephew, the son of my sister Anisya? Now do be quiet, you must be drunk. He has taken it into his head to play the lawyer, prince, and he practices speechifying, and is always repeating his eloquent pleadings to his children. And who do you think was his last client? An old woman who had been robbed of 500 roubles, her all, by some rogue of a usurer, besought him to take up her case. instead of which he defended the usurer himself, a Jew named Zeidler, because this Jew promised to give him 50 roubles. It was to be 50 if I won the case, only 5 if I lost," interrupted Lebedeff, speaking in a low tone, a great contrast to his earlier manner. "Well, naturally he came to grief. The law is not administered as it used to be, and he only got laughed at for his pains. But he was much pleased with himself in spite of that. 'Most learned judge,' said he, 'picture this unhappy man, crippled by age and infirmities, who gains his living by honourable toil. Picture him, I repeat, robbed of his all, of his last mouthful. Remember, I entreat you, the words of that learned legislator: let mercy and justice alike rule the courts of law.' Now, would you believe it, Excellency, every morning he recites this speech to us from beginning to end, exactly as he spoke it before the magistrate. Today we have heard it for the 5th time. He was just starting again when you arrived, so much does he admire it. He is now preparing to undertake another case. I think, by the way, that you are Prince Myshkin. Kolya tells me you are the cleverest man he has ever known." "The cleverest in the world," interrupted his uncle hastily. "I do not pay much attention to that opinion," continued the young man calmly. "Kolya is very fond of you, but he," pointing to Lebedeff, "is flattering you. I can assure you I have no intention of flattering you or anyone else, but at least you have some common sense. Well, will you judge between us? Shall we ask the prince to act as arbitrator?" he went on, addressing his uncle. "I am so glad you chanced to come here, prince." "I agree," said Lebedeff firmly, looking round involuntarily at his daughter, who had come nearer, and was listening attentively to the conversation. "What is it all about?" asked the prince, frowning. His head ached, and he felt sure that Lebedeff was trying to cheat him in some way, and only trying to put off the explanation that he had come for. "I will tell you all the story. I am his nephew. He did speak the truth there, although he is generally telling lies. I am at the university, and have not yet finished my course. I mean to do so, and I shall, for I have a determined character. I must, however, find something to do for the present, and therefore I have got employment on the railway at 24 roubles a month. I admit that my uncle has helped me once or twice before. Well, I had 20 roubles in my pocket, and I gambled them away. Can you believe that I should be so low, so base, as to lose money in that way? And the man who won it is a rogue whom you ought not to have paid," cried Lebedeff. "Yes, he is a rogue, but I was obliged to pay him," said the young man. "As to his being a rogue, he is assuredly that, and I am not saying it because he beat you. He is an ex-lieutenant, prince, dismissed from the service, a teacher of boxing, and one of Rogozhin's followers. They are all lounging about the pavements now that Rogozhin has turned them off. Of course, the worst of it is that, knowing he was a rascal and a card sharper, I nonetheless played palki with him and risked my last rouble. To tell the truth, I thought to myself, if I lose I will go to my uncle, and I'm sure he will not refuse to help me. Now that was base, cowardly and base." "That is so," observed Lebedeff quietly. "Cowardly and base." "Well, wait a bit before you begin to triumph," said the nephew viciously, for the words seemed to irritate him. "He is delighted. I came to him here and told him everything. I acted honourably, for I did not excuse myself. I spoke most severely of my conduct, as everyone here can witness. But I must smarten myself up before I take up my new post, for I am really like a tramp. Just look at my boots. I cannot possibly appear like this, and if I am not at the bureau at the time appointed, the job will be given to someone else, and I shall have to try for another. No, I only beg for 15 roubles, and I give my word that I will never ask him for anything again. I am also ready to promise to repay my debt in 3 months' time, and I will keep my word, even if I have to live on bread and water. My salary will amount to 75 roubles in 3 months. The sum I now ask, added to what I've borrowed already, will make a total of about 35 roubles. So you see I shall have enough to pay him, and confound him, if he wants interest, he shall have that too. Haven't I always paid back the money he lent me before? Why should he be so mean now? He grudges my having paid that lieutenant. There can be no other reason. That's the kind he is, a dog in the manger. And he won't go away, cried Lebedeff. He has installed himself here, and here he remains. I have told you already that I will not go away until I have got what I ask. Why are you smiling, Prince? You look as if you disapproved of me. I am not smiling, but I really think you are in the wrong, somewhat, replied Myshkin reluctantly. Don't shuffle. Say plainly that you think I am quite wrong, without any somewhat. Why somewhat? I will say you are quite wrong, if you wish. If I wish, that's good, I must say. Do you think I am deceived as to the flagrant impropriety of my conduct? I am quite aware that his money is his own, and that my action is much like an attempt at extortion. But you don't know what life is. If people don't learn by experience, they never understand. They must be taught. My intentions are perfectly honest. On my conscience, he will lose nothing, and I will pay back the money with interest. Added to which he has had the moral satisfaction of seeing me disgraced. What does he want more? And what is he good for if he never helps anyone? Look what he does himself. Just ask him about his dealings with others, how he deceives people. How did he manage to buy this house? You may cut off my head if he has not let you in for something, and if he is not trying to cheat you again. You are smiling. You don't believe me. It seems to me that all this has nothing to do with your affairs, remarked the prince. I have lain here now for 3 days, cried the young man without noticing, and I have seen a lot. Fancy, he suspects his daughter, that angel, that orphan, my cousin. He suspects her, and every evening he searches her room to see if she has a lover hidden in it. He comes here too, on tiptoe, creeping softly, oh, so softly, and looks under the sofa, my bed, you know. He is mad with suspicion, and sees a thief in every corner. He runs about all night long. He was up at least 7 times last night to satisfy himself that the windows and doors were barred, and to peep into the oven. That man who appears in court for scoundrels rushes in here in the night and prays, lying prostrate, banging his head on the ground by the half hour. And for whom do you think he prays? Who are the sinners figuring in his drunken petitions? I have heard him with my own ears, praying for the repose of the soul of the Countess du Barry. Kolya heard it too. He is as mad as a March hare. You hear how he slanders me, Prince, said Lebedeff, almost beside himself with rage. I may be a drunkard, an evildoer, a thief, but at least I can say one thing for myself. He does not know, how should he, mocker that he is, that when he came into the world it was I who washed him and dressed him in his swathing bands, for my sister Anicia had lost her husband and was in great poverty. I was very little better off than she, but I sat up night after night with her and nursed both mother and child. I used to go downstairs and steal wood for them from the house porter. How often did I sing him to sleep when I was half dead with hunger. In short, I was more than a father to him, and now he jeers at me. Even if I did cross myself and pray for the repose of the soul of the Comtesse du Barry, what does it matter? 3 days ago, for the first time in my life, I read her biography in an historical dictionary. Do you know who she was? You there, addressing his nephew. Speak, do you know? Of course, no one knows anything about her but you, muttered the young man in a would-be jeering tone. She was a countess who rose from shame to reign like a queen. An empress wrote to her with her own hand as ma chère cousine. At a lever du roi one morning, do you know what a lever du roi was? A cardinal, a papal legate, offered to put on her stockings. A high and holy person like that looked on it as an honour. Did you know this? I see by your expression that you did not. Well, how did she die? Answer. Oh, do stop, you are too absurd. This is how she died. After all this honour and glory, after having been almost a queen, she was guillotined by that butcher Samson. She was quite innocent, but it had to be done for the satisfaction of the fishwives of Paris. She was so terrified that she did not understand what was happening. But when Samson seized her head and pushed her under the knife with his foot, she cried out, wait a moment, monsieur." Well, because of that moment of bitter suffering, perhaps the Saviour will pardon her other faults, for one cannot imagine a greater agony. As I read the story, my heart bled for her. And what does it matter to you, little worm, if I implored the divine mercy for her, great sinner as she was, as I said my evening prayer? I might have done it because I doubted if anyone had ever crossed himself for her sake before. It may be that in the other world she will rejoice to think that a sinner like herself has cried to heaven for the salvation of her soul. Why are you laughing? You believe nothing, atheist. And your story was not even correct. If you had listened to what I was saying, you would have heard that I did not only pray for the Comtesse du Barry. I said, O Lord, give rest to the soul of that great sinner, the Comtesse du Barry, and to all unhappy ones like her. You see, that is quite a different thing. For how many sinners there are, how many women who have passed through the trials of this life are now suffering and groaning in purgatory. I prayed for you too, in spite of your insolence and impudence. Also for your fellows, as it seems that you claim to know how I pray. Oh, that's enough in all conscience. Pray for whom you choose, and the devil take them and you. We have a scholar here. You did not know that, Prince, he continued with a sneer. He reads all sorts of books and memoirs now. At any rate, your uncle has a kind heart, remarked the prince, who really had to force himself to speak to the nephew, so much did he dislike him. Oh, now you are going to praise him. He will be set up. He puts his hand on his heart, and he is delighted. I never said he was a man without heart, but he is a rascal. That's the pity of it. And then he is addicted to drink, and his mind is unhinged, like that of most people who have taken more than is good for them for years. He loves his children. Oh, I know that well enough. He respected my aunt, his late wife. And he even has a sort of affection for me. He has remembered me in his will. I shall leave you nothing, exclaimed his uncle angrily. Listen to me, Lebedev, said the prince in a decided voice, turning his back on the young man. I know by experience that when you choose you can be businesslike. I have very little time to spare, and if you... By the way, excuse me, what is your Christian name? I have forgotten it. Timofey. And? Lukyanovich. Everyone in the room began to laugh. "He's telling lies," cried the nephew. "Even now he cannot speak the truth. He is not called Timofey Lukyanovich, prince, but Lukian Timofeyovitch. Now do tell us why you must needs lie about it. Lukian or Timofey, it is all the same to you, and what difference can it make to the prince? He tells lies without the least necessity, simply by force of habit, I assure you." "Is that true?" said the prince impatiently. "My name really is Lukian Timofeyovitch," acknowledged Lebedeff, lowering his eyes and putting his hand on his heart. "Well, for God's sake, what made you say the other?" "To humble myself," murmured Lebedeff. "What on earth do you mean? Oh, if only I knew where Colia was at this moment!" cried the prince, standing up as if to go. "I can tell you all about Colia," said the young man. "Oh, no, no," said Lebedeff hurriedly. "Colia spent the night here, and this morning went after his father, whom you let out of prison by paying his debts. Heaven only knows why. Yesterday the general promised to come and lodge here, but he did not appear. Most probably he slept at the hotel close by. No doubt Colia is there, unless he has gone to Pavlovsk to see the Epanchins. He had a little money, and was intending to go there yesterday. He must be either at the hotel or at Pavlovsk." "At Pavlovsk? He is at Pavlovsk, undoubtedly," interrupted Lebedeff. "But come, let us go into the garden. We will have coffee there." And Lebedeff seized the prince's arm and led him from the room. They went across the yard and found themselves in a delightful little garden, with the trees already in their summer dress of green, thanks to the unusually fine weather. Lebedeff invited his guest to sit down on a green seat before a table of the same colour fixed in the earth, and took a seat facing him. In a few minutes the coffee appeared, and the prince did not refuse it. The host kept his eyes fixed on Myshkin with an expression of passionate servility. "I knew nothing about your home before," said the prince absently, as if he were thinking of something else. "Poor orphans," began Lebedeff, his face assuming a mournful air, but he stopped short, for the other looked at him inattentively, as if he had already forgotten his own remark. They waited a few minutes in silence, while Lebedeff sat with his eyes fixed mournfully on the young man's face. "Well," said the latter, at last rousing himself. "Ah, yes, you know why I came, Lebedeff. Your letter brought me. Speak, tell me all about it." The clerk, rather confused, tried to say something, hesitated, began to speak, and again stopped. The prince looked at him gravely. "I think I understand, Lukian Timofeyovitch. You were not sure that I should come. You did not think I should start at the first word from you, and you merely wrote to relieve your conscience. However, you see now that I have come, and I have had enough of trickery. Give up serving, or trying to serve, two masters. Rogozhin has been here these 3 weeks. Have you managed to sell her to him as you did before? Tell me the truth. He discovered everything, the monster, himself. Don't abuse him, though I dare say you have something to complain of." "He beat me, he thrashed me unmercifully," replied Lebedeff vehemently. "He set a dog on me in Moscow, a bloodhound, a terrible beast that chased me all down the street." "You seem to take me for a child, Lebedeff. Tell me, is it a fact that she left him while they were in Moscow?" "Yes, it is a fact, and this time, let me tell you, on the very eve of their marriage." It was a question of minutes when she slipped off to Petersburg. She came to me directly she arrived. 'Save me, Lukian, find me some refuge, and say nothing to the prince. She is afraid of you even more than she is of him, and in that she shows her wisdom.' And Lebedeff slyly put his finger to his brow as he said the last words. 'And now it is you who have brought them together again.' 'Excellency, how could I prevent it?' 'That will do. I can find out for myself. Only tell me, where is she now?' 'At his house, with him.' 'Oh no, certainly not.' 'I am free,' she says. You know how she insists on that point. 'I am entirely free.' She repeats it over and over again. She is living in Petersburgskaya with my sister-in-law, as I told you in my letter. She is there at this moment.' 'Yes, unless she has gone to Pavlovsk. The fine weather may have tempted her, perhaps, into the country with Daria Alexeyevna.' 'I am quite free,' she says. Only yesterday she boasted of her freedom to Nikolai Ardalionovitch. A bad sign," added Lebedeff, smiling. "Kolya goes to see her often, does he not?" "He is a strange boy, thoughtless, and inclined to be indiscreet." "Is it long since you saw her?" "I go to see her every day, every day." "Then you were there yesterday?" "No, I have not been there these 3 last days." "It is a pity you have taken too much wine, Lebedeff. I want to ask you something, but—" all right, I am not drunk," replied the clerk, preparing to listen. "Tell me, how was she when you left her?" "She is a woman who is seeking." "Seeking?" "She seems always to be searching about, as if she had lost something. The mere idea of her coming marriage disgusts her. She looks on it as an insult. She cares as much for him as for a piece of orange peel, not more. Yet I am much mistaken if she does not look on him with fear and trembling. She forbids his name to be mentioned before her, and they only meet when unavoidable. He understands well enough, but it must be gone through. She is restless, mocking, deceitful, violent." "Deceitful and violent?" "Yes, violent. I can give you a proof of it. A few days ago she tried to pull my hair because I said something that annoyed her. I tried to soothe her by reading the Apocalypse aloud." "What?" exclaimed the prince, thinking he had not heard aright. "By reading the Apocalypse. The lady has a restless imagination. She has a liking for conversation on serious subjects of any kind. In fact, they please her so much that it flatters her to discuss them. Now, for 15 years at least, I have studied the Apocalypse, and she agrees with me in thinking that the present is the epoch represented by the 3rd horse, the black one whose rider holds a measure in his hand. It seems to me that everything is ruled by a measure in our century. All men are clamouring for their rights, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. But added to this, men desire freedom of mind and body, a pure heart, a healthy life, and all of God's good gifts. Now, by pleading their rights alone, they will never attain all this, so the white horse, with his rider Death, comes next, and is followed by Hell. We talked about this matter when we met, and it impressed her very much." "Do you believe all this?" asked Myshkin, looking curiously at his companion. "I both believe it and explain it. I am but a poor creature, beggar, an atom in the scale of humanity. Who has the least respect for Lebedeff? He is a target for all the world, the butt of any fool who chooses to kick him. But in interpreting Revelation, I am the equal of anyone, great as he may be. Such is the power of the mind and the spirit. I have made a lordly personage tremble as he sat in his armchair, only by talking to him of things concerning the spirit. 2 years ago, on Easter Eve, His Excellency Nil Alexeyevich, whose subordinate I was then, wished to hear what I had to say, and sent a message by Peter Zakharich to ask me to go to his private room. They tell me you expound the prophecies relating to Antichrist, said he, when we were alone. Is that so? Yes, I answered unhesitatingly, and I began to give some comments on the apostle's allegorical vision. At first he smiled, but when we reached the numerical computations and correspondences, he trembled and turned pale. Then he begged me to close the book and sent me away, promising to put my name on the reward list. That took place, as I said, on the eve of Easter, and 8 days later his soul returned to God. What? It is the truth. One evening after dinner he stumbled as he stepped out of his carriage. He fell and struck his head on the curb and died immediately. He was 73 years of age and had a red face and white hair. He deluged himself with scent and was always smiling like a child. Peter Zakharich recalled my interview with him and said, "You foretold his death." The prince rose from his seat, and Lebedev, surprised to see his guest preparing to go so soon, remarked, "You are not interested," in a respectful tone. "I am not very well, and my head aches, doubtless the effect of the journey," replied the prince, frowning. "You should go into the country," said Lebedev timidly. The prince seemed to be considering the suggestion. "You see, I am going into the country myself in 3 days, with my children and belongings. The little one is delicate. She needs change of air, and during our absence this house will be done up. I am going to Pavlovsk." "You are going to Pavlovsk too?" asked the prince sharply. "Everybody seems to be going there. Have you a house in that neighbourhood?" "I don't know of many people going to Pavlovsk, and as for the house, Ivan Ptitsin has let me one of his villas rather cheaply. It is a pleasant place, lying on a hill surrounded by trees, and one can live there for a mere song. There is good music to be heard, so no wonder it is popular. I shall stay in the lodge. As to the villa itself—" "Have you let it?" "No, not exactly." "Let it to me." Now this was precisely what Lebedev had made up his mind to do in the last 3 minutes. Not that he had any difficulty in finding a tenant. In fact, the house was occupied at present by a chance visitor, who had told Lebedev that he would perhaps take it for the summer months. The clerk knew very well that this perhaps meant certainly, but as he thought he could make more out of a tenant like the prince, he felt justified in speaking vaguely about the present inhabitant's intentions. "This is quite a coincidence," thought he, and when the subject of price was mentioned, he made a gesture with his hand, as if to wave away a question of so little importance. "Oh, well, as you like," said Myshkin. "I will think it over. You shall lose nothing." They were walking slowly across the garden. "But if you... I could," stammered Lebedev. If you please, Prince, tell you something on the subject which would interest you, I'm sure." He spoke in wheedling tones and wriggled as he walked along. Myshkin stopped short. "Daria Alexeyevna also has a villa at Pavlovsk." "Well?" "A certain person is very friendly with her and intends to visit her pretty often."
"Well?"
"Aglaya Ivanovna."
"Oh,
Stop, Lebedev, interposed Myshkin, feeling as if he had been touched on an open wound. That has nothing to do with me. I should like to know when you are going to start. The sooner the better, as far as I am concerned, for I am at an hotel. They had left the garden now, and were crossing the yard on their way to the gate. Well, leave your hotel at once and come here. Then we can all go together to Pavlovsk the day after tomorrow. I will think about it, said the prince dreamily, and went off. The clerk stood looking after his guest, struck by his sudden absent-mindedness. He had not even remembered to say goodbye, and Lebedev was the more surprised at the omission, as he knew by experience how courteous the prince usually was. End of Part 2, Chapter 2. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 3 of The Idiot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Translated by Eva M. Martin. Part 2, Chapter 3. It was now close on 12 o'clock. The prince knew that if he called at the Epanchins' now, he would only find the general, and that the latter might probably carry him straight off to Pavlovsk with him, whereas there was one visit he was most anxious to make without delay. So, at the risk of missing General Epanchin altogether, and thus postponing his visit to Pavlovsk for a day at least, the prince decided to go and look for the house he desired to find. The visit he was about to pay was, in some respects, a risky one. He was in two minds about it, but knowing that the house was in the Gorokhovaya, not far from the Sadovaya, he determined to go in that direction, and to try to make up his mind on the way. Arrived at the point where the Gorokhovaya crosses the Sadovaya, he was surprised to find how excessively agitated he was. He had no idea that his heart could beat so painfully. One house in the Gorokhovaya began to attract his attention long before he reached it, and the prince remembered afterwards that he had said to himself, "That is the house, I'm sure of it." He came up to it, quite curious to discover whether he had guessed right, and felt that he would be disagreeably impressed to find that he had actually done so. The house was a large, gloomy-looking structure, without the slightest claim to architectural beauty, in colour a dirty green. There are a few of these old houses, built towards the end of the last century, still standing in that part of St. Petersburg, and showing little change from their original form and colour. They are solidly built, and are remarkable for the thickness of their walls, and for the fewness of their windows, many of which are covered by gratings. On the ground floor there is usually a money-changer's shop, and the owner lives over it. Without, as well as within, the houses seem inhospitable and mysterious, an impression which is difficult to explain, unless it has something to do with the actual architectural style. These houses are almost exclusively inhabited by the merchant class. Arrived at the gate, the prince looked up at the legend over it, which ran, "House of Rogozhin, hereditary and honourable citizen." He hesitated no longer, but opened the glazed door at the bottom of the outer stairs, and made his way up to the second story. The place was dark and gloomy looking. The walls of the stone staircase were painted a dull red. Rogozhin and his mother and brother occupied the whole of the second floor. The servant who opened the door to Myshkin led him, without taking his name, through several rooms and up and down many steps until they arrived at a door, where he knocked. Parfen Rogozhin opened the door himself. On seeing the prince he became deadly white, and apparently fixed to the ground, so that he was more like a marble statue than a human being. The prince had expected some surprise, but Rogozhin evidently considered his visit an impossible and miraculous event. He stared with an expression almost of terror, and his lips twisted into a bewildered smile. "Parfen, perhaps my visit is ill-timed. I can go away again if you like," said Myshkin at last, rather embarrassed. No, it's all right, come in," said Parfen, recollecting himself. They were evidently on quite familiar terms. In Moscow they had had many occasions of meeting. Indeed, some few of these meetings were but too vividly impressed upon their memories. They had not met now, however, for 3 months. The death-like pallor and a sort of slight convulsion about the lips had not left Rogozhin's face. Though he welcomed his guest, he was still obviously much disturbed. As he invited the prince to sit down near the table, the latter happened to turn towards him, and was startled by the strange expression on his face. A painful recollection flashed into his mind. He stood for a time looking straight at Rogozhin, whose eyes seemed to blaze like fire. At last Rogozhin smiled, though he still looked agitated and shaken. "What are you staring at me like that for?" he muttered. "Sit down." The prince took a chair. "Parfen," he said, "tell me honestly, did you know that I was coming to Petersburg or no?" "Oh, I supposed you were coming," the other replied, smiling sarcastically. "And I was right in my supposition, you see. But how was I to know that you would come today?" A certain strangeness and impatience in his manner impressed the prince very forcibly. "And if you had known that I was coming today, why be so irritated about it?" he asked in quiet surprise. "Why did you ask me?" "Because when I jumped out of the train this morning, 2 eyes glared at me, just as yours did a moment since." "Ha! And whose eyes may they have been?" said Rogozhin suspiciously. It seemed to the prince that he was trembling. "I don't know. I thought it was a hallucination. I often have hallucinations nowadays. I feel just as I did 5 years ago, when my fits were about to come on." "Well, perhaps it was a hallucination, I don't know," said Parfen. He tried to give the prince an affectionate smile, and it seemed to the latter as though, in this smile of his, something had broken, and that he could not mend it, try as he would. "Shall you go abroad again, then?" he asked, and suddenly added, "Do you remember when we came up in the train from Pskov together? You and your cloak and leggings, eh?" And Rogozhin burst out laughing, this time with unconcealed malice, as though he were glad that he had been able to find an opportunity for giving vent to it. "Have you quite taken up your quarters here?" asked the prince. "Yes, I'm at home. Where else should I go to?" "We haven't met for some time. Meanwhile I have heard things about you which I should not have believed to be possible." "What of that? People will say anything," said Rogozhin dryly. "At all events, you've disbanded your troupe, and you are living in your own house instead of being fast and loose about the place. That's all very good. Is this house all yours, or joint property?" "It is my mother's. You get to her apartments by that passage." "Where's your brother?" "In the other wing." "Is he married?" "Widower. Why do you want to know all this?" The prince looked at him, but said nothing. He had suddenly relapsed into musing, and had probably not heard the question at all. Rogozhin did not insist upon an answer, and there was silence for a few moments. "I guessed which was your house from 100 yards off," said the prince at last. "Why so?" "I don't quite know. Your house has the aspect of yourself and all your family. It bears the stamp of the Rogozhin life. But ask me why I think so, and I can tell you nothing. It is nonsense, of course. I am nervous about this kind of thing troubling me so much. I had never before imagined what sort of house you would live in, and yet no sooner did I set my eyes on this one than I said to myself that it must be yours." "Really?" said Rogozhin vaguely, not taking in what the prince meant by his rather obscure remarks. The room they were now sitting in was a large one, lofty but dark, well furnished, principally with writing tables and desks covered with papers and books. A wide sofa covered with red morocco evidently served Rogozhin for a bed. On the table beside which the prince had been invited to seat himself lay some books. One, containing a marker where the reader had left off, was a volume of Solovieff's history. Some oil paintings in worn gilded frames hung on the walls, but it was impossible to make out what subjects they represented, so blackened were they by smoke and age. One, a life-sized portrait, attracted the prince's attention. It showed a man of about 50, wearing a long riding coat of German cut. He had 2 medals on his breast. His beard was white, short and thin. His face yellow and wrinkled, with a sly, suspicious expression in the eyes. "That is your father, is it not?" asked the prince. "Yes, it is," replied Rogozhin with an unpleasant smile, as if he had expected his guest to ask the question, and then to make some disagreeable remark. "Was he one of the old believers?" "No, he went to church, but to tell the truth he really preferred the old religion. This was his study and is now mine. Why did you ask if he were an old believer?" "Are you going to be married here?" "Yes," replied Rogozhin, starting at the unexpected question. "Soon?" "You know yourself it does not depend on me." "Parfen, I am not your enemy, and I do not intend to oppose your intentions in any way. I repeat this to you now, just as I said it to you once before, on a very similar occasion. When you were arranging for your projected marriage in Moscow, I did not interfere with you. You know I did not. That first time she fled to me from you, from the very altar almost, and begged me to save her from you. Afterwards she ran away from me again, and you found her and arranged your marriage with her once more. And now, I hear, she has run away from you and come to Petersburg. Is it true? Lebedeff wrote me to this effect, and that's why I came here. That you had once more arranged matters with Nastasya Filippovna I only learned last night in the train from a friend of yours, Zaleshev, if you wish to know. I confess I came here with an object. I wished to persuade Nastasya to go abroad for her health. She requires it. Both mind and body need a change badly. I did not intend to take her abroad myself. I was going to arrange for her to go without me. Now, I tell you honestly, Parfen, if it is true that all is made up between you, I will not so much as set eyes upon her, and I will never even come to see you again. You know quite well that I am telling the truth, because I have always been frank with you. I have never concealed my own opinion from you. I have always told you that I consider a marriage between you and her would be ruin to her. You would also be ruined, and perhaps even more hopelessly. If this marriage were to be broken off again, I admit I should be greatly pleased, but at the same time I have not the slightest intention of trying to part you. You may be quite easy in your mind, and you need not suspect me. You know yourself whether I was ever really your rival or not, even when she ran away and came to me. There, you are laughing at me. I know why you laugh. It is perfectly true that we lived apart from one another all the time, in different towns. I told you before that I did not love her with love, but with pity. You said then that you understood me. Did you really understand me or not? What hatred there is in your eyes at this moment! I came to relieve your mind, because you are dear to me also. I love you very much, Parfen, and now I shall go away, and never come back again. Goodbye." The prince rose. "Stay a little," said Parfen, not leaving his chair and resting his head on his right hand. "I haven't seen you for a long time." The prince sat down again. Both were silent for a few moments. "When you are not with me, I hate you, Fyodor Nikolayevich. I have loathed you every day of these 3 months since I last saw you. By heaven I have," said Rogozhin. "I could have poisoned you at any minute. Now you have been with me but a quarter of an hour, and all my malice seems to have melted away, and you are as dear to me as ever. Stay here a little longer. When I am with you, you trust me, but as soon as my back is turned, you suspect me," said the prince, smiling, and trying to hide his emotion. "I trust your voice when I hear you speak. I quite understand that you and I cannot be put on a level, of course." "Why did you add that? There, now you are cross again," said the prince, wondering. "We were not asked, you see. We were made different, with different tastes and feelings, without being consulted. You say you love her with pity. I have no pity for her. She hates me, that's the plain truth of the matter. I dream of her every night, and always that she is laughing at me with another man. And so she does laugh at me. She thinks no more of marrying me than if she were changing her shoe. Would you believe it? I haven't seen her for 5 days, and I daren't go near her. She asks me what I come for, as if she were not content with having disgraced me." "Disgraced you? How?" "Just as though you didn't know. Why, she ran away from me and went to you. You admitted it yourself just now." "But surely you do not believe that she did not disgrace me at Moscow with that officer, Zemtushnikov?" "I know for certain she did, after having fixed our marriage day herself." "Impossible!" cried the prince. "I know it for a fact," replied Rogozhin with conviction. "It is not like her, you say? My friend, that's absurd. Perhaps such an act would horrify her if she were with you, but it is quite different where I am concerned. She looks on me as vermin. Her affair with Keller was simply to make a laughing-stock of me. You don't know what a fool she made of me in Moscow, and the money I spent over her. The money! And you can marry her now, Parfen. What will come of it all?" said the prince with dread in his voice. Rogozhin gazed back gloomily, and with a terrible expression in his eyes, but said nothing. "I haven't been to see her for 5 days," he repeated after a slight pause. "I'm afraid of being turned out. She says she's still her own mistress, and may turn me off altogether and go abroad. She told me this herself," he said with a peculiar glance at Myshkin. "I think she often does it merely to frighten me. She is always laughing at me for some reason or other. But at other times she's angry and won't say a word, and that's what I'm afraid of. I took her a shawl one day, the like of which she might never have seen, although she did live in luxury, and she gave it away to her maid, Katya. Sometimes, when I can keep away no longer, I steal past the house on the sly, and once I watched her at the gate till dawn. I thought something was going on, and she saw me from the window. She asked me what I should do if I found she had deceived me. I said, 'You know well enough.'" "What did she know?" cried the prince. "How was I to tell?" replied Rogozhin with an angry laugh. "I did my best to catch her tripping in Moscow, but did not succeed. However, I caught hold of her one day and said, 'You're engaged to be married into a respectable family, and do you know what sort of woman you are? That's the sort of woman you are,' I said." "You told her that?" "Yes." "Well, go on." "She said, 'I wouldn't even have you for a footman now, much less for a husband.' 'I shan't leave the house,' I said, 'so it doesn't matter.' 'Then I shall call somebody and have you kicked out,' she cried. So then I rushed at her and beat her till she was bruised all over." "Impossible!" cried the prince, aghast. "I tell you it's true," said Rogozhin quietly, but with eyes ablaze with passion. "Then for a day and a half I neither slept nor ate nor drank, and would not leave her. I knelt at her feet. 'I shall die here,' I said, 'if you don't forgive me. And if you have me turned out, I shall drown myself. Because what should I be without you now?' She was like a madwoman all that day. Now she would cry, now she would threaten me with a knife, now she would abuse me. She called in Zaleshev and Keller, and showed me to them, shamed me in their presence. 'Let's all go to the theatre,' she says, 'and leave him here if he won't go. It's not my business. They'll give you some tea, Parfen Semyonovitch, while I'm away, for you must be hungry.' She came back from the theatre alone. 'Those cowards wouldn't come,' she said. 'They are afraid of you, and try to frighten me too. He won't go away as he came,' they said. 'He'll cut your throat. See if he doesn't. Now I shall go to my bedroom, and I shall not even lock my door, just to show you how much I am afraid of you. You must be shown that once for all. Did you have tea?' 'No,' I said, 'and I don't intend to.' 'Ha ha! You are playing off your pride against your stomach. That sort of heroism doesn't sit well on you,' she said. With that she did as she had said she would. She went to bed and did not lock her door. In the morning she came out. 'Are you quite mad?' she said sharply. 'Why, you'll die of hunger like this.' 'Forgive me,' I said. 'No, I won't, and I won't marry you. I've said it. Surely you haven't sat in this chair all night without sleeping.' 'I didn't sleep,' I said. How sensible of you. And are you going to have no breakfast or dinner today?' 'I told you I wouldn't.' 'Forgive me.' 'You've no idea how unbecoming this sort of thing is to you,' she said. 'It's like putting a saddle on a cow's back. Do you think you are frightening me? My word, what a dreadful thing that you should sit here and eat no food. How terribly frightened I am.' She wasn't angry long, and didn't seem to resent my offence at all. I was surprised, for she is a vindictive, resentful woman. But then I thought perhaps she despised me too much to feel any resentment against me. And that's the truth. She came up to me and said, Do you know who the Pope of Rome is?" "I've heard of him," I said. "I suppose you've read the Universal History, Parfen Semyonovitch, haven't you?" she asked. "I've learned nothing at all," I said. "Then I'll lend it to you to read. You must know there was a Roman Pope once, and he was very angry with a certain emperor. So the emperor came and neither ate nor drank, but knelt before the Pope's palace till he should be forgiven. And what sort of vows do you think that the emperor was making during all those days on his knees? Stop, I'll read it to you." Then she read me a lot of verses where it said that the emperor spent all the time vowing vengeance against the Pope. "You don't mean to say you don't approve of the poem, Parfen Semyonovitch?" she says. "All you have read out is perfectly true," say I. "Aha!" says she, "you admit it's true, do you? And you are making vows to yourself that if I marry you, you will remind me of all this and take it out of me." "I don't know," I say. "Perhaps I was thinking like that, and perhaps I was not. I'm not thinking of anything just now." "What are your thoughts, then?" "I'm thinking that when you rise from your chair and go past me, I watch you and follow you with my eyes. If your dress does but rustle, my heart sinks. If you leave the room, I remember every little word and action, and what your voice sounded like, and what you said. I thought of nothing all last night, but sat here listening to your sleeping breath, and heard you move a little, twice. And as for your attack upon me," she says, "I suppose you never once thought of that?" "Perhaps I did think of it, and perhaps not," I say. "And what if I don't either forgive you or marry you?" "I tell you I shall go and drown myself." She said, and then relapsed into silence. Then she got angry and went out. "I suppose you'd murder me before you drowned yourself, though," she cried as she left the room. An hour later she came to me again, looking melancholy. "I will marry you, Parfen Semyonovitch," she says, "not because I'm frightened of you, but because it's all the same to me how I ruin myself. And how can I do it better? Sit down, they'll bring you some dinner directly. And if I do marry you, I'll be a faithful wife to you, you need not doubt that." Then she thought a bit and said, "At all events, you are not a flunkey. At first I thought you were no better than a flunkey." And she arranged the wedding and fixed the day straight away on the spot. Then in another week she had run away again and came here to Lebedeff's. And when I found her here, she said to me, "I'm not going to renounce you altogether, but I wish to put off the wedding a bit longer yet, just as long as I like, for I'm still my own mistress, so you may wait if you like." That's how the matter stands between us now. What do you think of all this, Lef Nikolayevich?" "What do you think of it yourself?" replied the prince, looking sadly at Rogozhin. "As if I can think anything about it. He was about to say more, but stopped in despair. The prince rose again, as if he would leave. "At all events, I shall not interfere with you," he murmured, as though making answer to some secret thought of his own. "I'll tell you what," cried Rogozhin, and his eyes flashed fire. "I can't understand your yielding her to me like this. I don't understand it. Have you given up loving her altogether? At first you suffered badly. I know it. I saw it. Besides, why did you come post-haste after us? Out of pity, eh? Ha ha ha!" His mouth curved in a mocking smile. "Do you think I am deceiving you?" asked the prince. "No, I trust you, but I can't understand. It seems to me that your pity is greater than my love. A hungry longing to speak his mind out seemed to flash in the man's eyes, combined with an intense anger. "Your love is mingled with hatred, and therefore, when your love passes, there will be the greater misery," said the prince. "I tell you this, Parfen." "What, that I'll cut her throat, you mean?" The prince shuddered. "You'll hate her afterwards for all your present love, and for all the torment you are suffering on her account now. What seems to me the most extraordinary thing is that she can again consent to marry you, after all that has passed between you. When I heard the news yesterday, I could hardly bring myself to believe it. Why, she has run twice from you, from the very altar rails, as it were. She must have some presentiment of evil. What can she want with you now? Your money? Nonsense! Besides, I should think you must have made a fairly large hole in your fortune already. Surely it is not because she is so very anxious to find a husband. She could find many a one besides yourself. Anyone would be better than you, because you will murder her. And I feel sure she must know that but too well by now. Is it because you love her so passionately? Indeed, that may be it. I have heard that there are women who want just that kind of love. But still..." The prince paused reflectively. "What are you grinning at my father's portrait again for?" asked Rogozhin suddenly. He was carefully observing every change in the expression of the prince's face. "I smiled because the idea came into my head that if it were not for this unhappy passion of yours, you might have, and would have, become just such a man as your father, and that very quickly too. You'd have settled down in this house of yours with some silent and obedient wife. You would have spoken rarely, trusted no one, heeded no one, and thought of nothing but making money." "Laugh away! She said exactly the same, almost word for word, when she saw my father's portrait. It's remarkable how entirely you and she are at one nowadays." "What, has she been here?" asked the prince with curiosity. "Yes. She looked long at the portrait and asked all about my father. 'You'd be just such another,' she said at last, and laughed. 'You have such strong passions, Parfen,' she said, 'that they'd have taken you to Siberia in no time, if you had not, luckily, intelligence as well. For you have a good deal of intelligence.' She said this, believe it or not, the first time I ever heard anything of that sort from her. You'd soon have thrown up all this rowdyism that you indulge in now, and you'd have settled down to quiet, steady money-making, because you have little education. And here you'd have stayed just like your father before you, and you'd have loved your money, so that you'd amass not 2 million like him, but 10 million, and you'd have died of hunger on your money-bags to finish up with, for you carry everything to extremes.' There, that's exactly word for word as she said it to me. She never talked to me like that before. She always talks nonsense and laughs when she's with me. We went all over this old house together. 'I shall change all this,' I said, 'or else I'll buy a new house for the wedding.' 'No, no,' she said. 'Don't touch anything. Leave it all as it is. I shall live with your mother when I marry you.' I took her to see my mother, and she was as respectful and kind as though she were her own daughter. Mother has been almost demented ever since father died. She's an old woman. She sits and bows from her chair to everyone she sees. If you left her alone and didn't feed her for 3 days, I don't believe she would notice it. Well, I took her hand and I said, 'Give your blessing to this lady, mother. She's going to be my wife.' So Nastasya kissed Mother's hand with great feeling. "She must have suffered terribly, hasn't she?" she said. She saw this book lying here before me. "What, have you begun to read Russian history?" she asked. She told me once in Moscow, you know, that I had better get Soloviev's Russian history and read it, because I knew nothing. "That's good," she said. "You go on like that, reading books. I'll make you a list myself of the books you ought to read first, shall I?" She had never once spoken to me like this before. It was the first time I felt I could breathe before her like a living creature. "I'm very, very glad to hear of this, Parfen," said the prince with real feeling. "Who knows, maybe God will yet bring you near to one another." "Never, never!" cried Rogozhin excitedly. "Look here, Parfen, if you love her so much, surely you must be anxious to earn her respect. And if you do so wish, surely you may hope to. I said just now that I considered it extraordinary that she could still be ready to marry you. Well, though I cannot yet understand it, I feel sure she must have some good reason, or she wouldn't do it. She is sure of your love, but besides that, she must attribute something else to you, some good qualities, otherwise the thing would not be. What you have just said confirms my words. You say yourself that she found it possible to speak to you quite differently from her usual manner. You are suspicious, you know, and jealous. Therefore, when anything annoying happens to you, you exaggerate its significance. Of course, she does not think so ill of you as you say. Why, if she did, she would simply be walking to death by drowning, or by the knife, with her eyes wide open, when she married you. It is impossible. As if anybody would go to their death deliberately." Rogozhin listened to the prince's excited words with a bitter smile. His conviction was apparently unalterable. "How dreadfully you look at me, Parfen," said the prince with a feeling of dread. "Water or the knife?" said the latter at last. "Ha, ha! That's exactly why she is going to marry me, because she knows for certain that the knife awaits her. Prince, can it be that you don't even yet see what's at the root of it all?" "I don't understand you." "Perhaps he really doesn't understand me. They do say that you are a you-know-what. She loves another. There, you can understand that much. Just as I love her, exactly so she loves another man. And that other man is, do you know who? It's you. There, you didn't know that, eh?" "I? You? She has loved you ever since that day, her birthday. Only she thinks she cannot marry you, because it would be the ruin of you. 'Everybody knows what sort of a woman I am,' she says. She told me all this herself, to my very face. She's afraid of disgracing and ruining you, she says. But it doesn't matter about me. She can marry me all right. Notice how much consideration she shows for me." "But why did she run away to me, and then again from me to—" "From you to me. Ha, ha! That's nothing. Why, she always acts as though she were in a delirium nowadays. Either she says, 'Come on, I'll marry you, let's have the wedding quickly,' and fixes the day, and seems in a hurry for it, and when it begins to come near she feels frightened. Or else some other idea gets into her head. Goodness knows, you've seen her, you know how she goes on, laughing and crying and raving. There's nothing extraordinary about her having run away from you. She ran away because she found out how dearly she loved you. She could not bear to be near you. You said just now that I had found her at Moscow, when she ran away from you. I didn't do anything of the sort. She came to me herself, straight from you. "Name the day, I'm ready," she said. "Let's have some champagne and go and hear the gypsies sing." I tell you, she'd have thrown herself into the water long ago if it were not for me. She doesn't do it because I am, perhaps, even more dreadful to her than the water. She's marrying me out of spite. If she marries me, I tell you, it will be for spite. "But how can you?" began the prince, gazing with dread and horror at Rogozhin. "Why don't you finish your sentence? Shall I tell you what you were thinking to yourself just then? You were thinking, how can she marry him after this? How can it possibly be permitted? Oh, I know what you were thinking about." "I didn't come here for that purpose, Parfen. That was not in my mind." "That may be. Perhaps you didn't come with the idea, but the idea is certainly there now. Well, that's enough. What are you upset about? Didn't you really know it all before? You astonish me." "All this is mere jealousy. It is some malady of yours, Parfen. You exaggerate everything," said the prince, excessively agitated. "What are you doing?" "Let go of it," said Parfen, seizing from the prince's hand a knife which the latter had at that moment taken up from the table, where it lay beside the history. Parfen replaced it where it had been. "I seemed to know it. I felt it when I was coming back to Petersburg," continued the prince. "I did not want to come. I wished to forget all this, to uproot it from my memory altogether. Well, goodbye. What is the matter?" He had absently taken up the knife a second time, and again Rogozhin snatched it from his hand and threw it down on the table. It was a plain-looking knife with a bone handle, a blade about 8 inches long, and broad in proportion. It did not clasp. Seeing that the prince was considerably struck by the fact that he had twice seized this knife out of his hand, Rogozhin caught it up with some irritation, put it inside the book, and threw the latter across to another table. "Do you cut your pages with it, or what?" asked Myshkin, still rather absently, as though unable to throw off a deep preoccupation into which the conversation had thrown him. "Yes." "It's a garden knife, isn't it?" "Yes, can't one cut pages with a garden knife?" "It's quite new." "Well, what of that? Can't I buy a new knife if I like?" shouted Rogozhin furiously, his irritation growing with every word. The prince shuddered and gazed fixedly at Parfen. Suddenly he burst out laughing. "Why, what an idea!" he said. "I didn't mean to ask you any of these questions. I was thinking of something quite different. But my head is heavy, and I seem so absent-minded nowadays. Well, goodbye. I can't remember what I wanted to say. Goodbye." "Not that way," said Rogozhin. "There, I've forgotten that too. This way. Come along, I'll show you." End of Part 2, Chapter 3. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 4 of The Idiot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Translated by Eva M. Martin. Part 2, Chapter 4. They passed through the same rooms which the prince had traversed on his arrival. In the largest there were pictures on the walls, portraits and landscapes of little interest. Over the door, however, there was one of strange and rather striking shape. It was 6 or 7 feet in length, and not more than a foot in height. It represented the Saviour just taken from the cross. The prince glanced at it, but took no further notice. He moved on hastily, as though anxious to get out of the house. But Rogozhin suddenly stopped underneath the picture. "My father picked up all these pictures very cheap at auctions and so on," he said. "They are all rubbish, except the one over the door, and that is valuable. A man offered 500 roubles for it last week." "Yes, that's a copy of a Holbein," said the prince, looking at it again. "And a good copy, too, as far as I am able to judge. I saw the picture abroad and could not forget it. What's the matter?" Rogozhin had dropped the subject of the picture and walked on. Of course his strange frame of mind was sufficient to account for his conduct, but still it seemed queer to the prince that he should so abruptly drop a conversation commenced by himself. Rogozhin did not take any notice of his question. "Lef Nikolayevich," said Rogozhin after a pause, during which the two walked along a little further, "I have long wished to ask you, do you believe in God?" "How strangely you speak, and how odd you look," said the other involuntarily. "I like looking at that picture," muttered Rogozhin, not noticing apparently that the prince had not answered his question. "That picture! That picture!" cried Myshkin, struck by a sudden idea. "Why, a man's faith might be ruined by looking at that picture." "So it is," said Rogozhin unexpectedly. They had now reached the front door. The prince stopped. "How?" he said. "What do you mean? I was half joking, and you took me up quite seriously. Why do you ask me whether I believe in God?" "Oh, no particular reason. I meant to ask you before. Many people are unbelievers nowadays, especially Russians, I've been told. You ought to know, you've lived abroad." Rogozhin laughed bitterly as he said these words, and opening the door, held it for the prince to pass out. Myshkin looked surprised, but went out. The other followed him as far as the landing of the outer stairs, and shut the door behind him. They both now stood facing one another, as though oblivious of where they were, or what they had to do next. "Well, goodbye," said the prince, holding out his hand. "Goodbye," said Rogozhin, pressing it hard, but quite mechanically. The prince made one step forward, and then turned round. "As to faith," he said, smiling, and evidently unwilling to leave Rogozhin in this state, "as to faith, I had 4 curious conversations in 2 days, a week or so ago. One morning I met a man in the train, and made acquaintance with him at once. I had often heard of him as a very learned man, but an atheist. I was very glad of the opportunity of conversing with so eminent and clever a person. He doesn't believe in God, and he talked a good deal about it, but all the while it appeared to me that he was speaking outside the subject. And it has always struck me, both in speaking to such men and in reading their books, that they do not seem really to be touching on that at all, though on the surface they may appear to do so. I told him this, but I dare say I did not clearly express what I meant, for he could not understand me. That same evening I stopped at a small provincial hotel, and it so happened that a dreadful murder had been committed there the night before, and everybody was talking about it. 2 peasants, elderly men and old friends, had had tea together there the night before, and were to occupy the same bedroom. They were not drunk, but one of them had noticed for the first time that his friend possessed a silver watch which he was wearing on a chain. He was by no means a thief, and was, as peasants go, a rich man. But this watch so fascinated him that he could not restrain himself. He took a knife, and when his friend turned his back, he came up softly behind, raised his eyes to heaven, crossed himself, and saying earnestly, "God forgive me, for Christ's sake," he cut his friend's throat like a sheep, and took the watch. Rogozhin roared with laughter. He laughed as though he were in a sort of fit. It was strange to see him laughing so after the sombre mood he had been in just before. "Oh, I'd like that! That beats anything!" he cried convulsively, panting for breath. "One is an absolute unbeliever. The other is such a thoroughgoing believer that he murders his friend to the tune of a prayer. Oh, Prince, Prince, that's too good for anything. You can't have invented it. It's the best thing I've heard." "Next morning I went out for a stroll through the town," continued the prince, so soon as Rogozhin was a little quieter, though his laughter still burst out at intervals, and soon observed a drunken-looking soldier staggering about the pavement. He came up to me and said, "Buy my silver cross, sir. You shall have it for 4d. It's real silver." I looked, and there he held a cross, just taken from his own neck evidently, a large tin one, made after the Byzantine pattern. I fished out 4d and put his cross on my own neck, and could see by his face that he was as pleased as he could be at the thought that he had succeeded in cheating a foolish gentleman, and away he went to drink the value of his cross. At that time everything that I saw made a tremendous impression upon me. I had understood nothing about Russia before, and had only vague and fantastic memories of it. So I thought, I will wait a while before I condemn this Judas. Only God knows what may be hidden in the hearts of drunkards. Well, I went homewards, and near the hotel I came across a poor woman carrying a child, a baby of some 6 weeks old. The mother was quite a girl herself. The baby was smiling up at her for the first time in its life, just at that moment, and while I watched the woman, she suddenly crossed herself. Oh, so devoutly. "What is it, my good woman?" I asked her. I was never but asking questions then. "Exactly as is a mother's joy when her baby smiles for the first time into her eyes, so is God's joy when one of his children turns and prays to him for the first time, with all his heart." This is what the poor woman said to me, almost word for word, and such a deep, refined, truly religious thought it was, a thought in which the whole essence of Christianity was expressed in one flash. That is, the recognition of God as our Father, and of God's joy in men as his own children, which is the chief idea of Christ. She was a simple countrywoman, a mother, it's true, and perhaps, who knows, she may have been the wife of the drunken soldier. Listen, Parfen, you put a question to me just now. This is my reply. The essence of religious feeling has nothing to do with reason, or atheism, or crime, or acts of any kind. It has nothing to do with these things, and never had. There is something besides all this, something which the arguments of the atheists can never touch. But the principal thing, and the conclusion of my argument, is that this is most clearly seen in the heart of a Russian. This is a conviction which I have gained while I have been in this Russia of ours. Yes, Parfen, there is work to be done. There is work to be done in this Russian world. Remember what talks we used to have in Moscow. And I never wished to come here at all, and I never thought to meet you like this, Parfen. Well, well. Goodbye, goodbye. God be with you." He turned and went downstairs. "Lef Nikolayevich," cried Parfen before he had reached the next landing. "Have you got that cross you bought from the soldier with you?" "Yes, I have," and the prince stopped again. "Show it me, will you?" A new fancy, the prince reflected, and then mounted the stairs once more. He pulled out the cross without taking it off his neck. "Give it to me," said Parfen. "Why? Do you—" The prince would rather have kept this particular cross. "I'll wear it, and you shall have mine. I'll take it off at once." "You wish to exchange crosses? Very well, Parfen, if that's the case, I'm glad enough. That makes us brothers, you know." The prince took off his tin cross, Parfen his gold one, and the exchange was made. Parfen was silent. With sad surprise, the prince observed that the look of distrust, the bitter, ironical smile, had still not altogether left his newly adopted brother's face. At moments, at all events, it showed itself but too plainly. At last Rogozhin took the prince's hand, and stood so for some moments, as though he could not make up his mind. Then he drew him along, murmuring almost inaudibly, "Come." They stopped on the landing, and rang the bell at a door opposite to Parfen's own lodging. A woman opened to them and bowed low to Parfen, who asked her some questions hurriedly, but did not wait to hear her answer. He led the prince on through several dark, cold-looking rooms, spotlessly clean, with white covers over all the furniture. Without the ceremony of knocking, Parfen entered a small apartment, furnished like a drawing-room, but with a polished mahogany partition dividing one half of it from what was probably a bedroom. In one corner of this room sat an old woman in an armchair, close to the stove. She did not look very old, and her face was a pleasant, round one, but she was white-haired, and, as one could detect at the first glance, quite in her second childhood. She wore a black woolen dress, with a black handkerchief round her neck and shoulders, and a white cap with black ribbons. Her feet were raised on a footstool. Beside her sat another old woman, also dressed in mourning, and silently knitting a stocking. This was evidently a companion. They both looked as though they never broke the silence. The first old woman, so soon as she saw Rogozhin and the prince, smiled and bowed courteously several times, in token of her gratification at their visit. "Mother," said Rogozhin, kissing her hand, "here is my great friend, Prince Myshkin. We have exchanged crosses. He was like a real brother to me at Moscow at one time, and did a great deal for me. Bless him, mother, as you would bless your own son. Wait a moment, let me arrange your hands for you." But the old lady, before Parfen had time to touch her, raised her right hand, and with 3 fingers held up, devoutly made the sign of the cross 3 times over the prince. She then nodded her head kindly at him once more. "There, come along, Lef Nikolayevich. That's all I brought you here for," said Rogozhin. When they reached the stairs again, he added, "She understood nothing of what I said to her, and did not know what I wanted her to do, and yet she blessed you. That shows she wished to do so herself. Well, goodbye, it's time you went, and I must go too." He opened his own door. "Well, let me at least embrace you and say goodbye, you strange fellow," cried the prince, looking with gentle reproach at Rogozhin, and advancing towards him. But the latter had hardly raised his arms when he dropped them again. He could not make up his mind to it. He turned away from the prince in order to avoid looking at him. He could not embrace him. "Don't be afraid," he muttered indistinctly. "Though I have taken your cross, I shall not murder you for your watch." So saying, he laughed suddenly and strangely. Then in a moment his face became transfigured. He grew deadly white. His lips trembled, his eyes burned like fire. He stretched out his arms and held the prince tightly to him, and said in a strangled voice, "Well, take her. It's fate. She's yours. I surrender her. Remember Rogozhin." And pushing the prince from him, without looking back at him, he hurriedly entered his own flat and banged the door. End of Part 2, Chapter 4. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. 2, Chapter 5 of The Idiot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Translated by Eva M. Martin. Part 2, Chapter 5. It was late now, nearly 2:30, and the prince did not find General Epanchin at home. He left a card and determined to look up Kolya, who had a room at a small hotel near. Kolya was not in, but he was informed that he might be back shortly, and had left word that if he were not in by 3:30, it was to be understood that he had gone to Pavlovsk to General Epanchin's and would dine there. The prince decided to wait till 3:30 and ordered some dinner. At 3:30 there was no sign of Kolya. The prince waited until 4 o'clock and then strolled off mechanically, wherever his feet should carry him. In early summer there are often magnificent days in St. Petersburg, bright, hot and still. This happened to be such a day. For some time the prince wandered about without aim or object. He did not know the town well. He stopped to look about him on bridges, at street corners. He entered a confectioner's shop to rest once. He was in a state of nervous excitement and perturbation. He noticed nothing and no one, and he felt a craving for solitude, to be alone with his thoughts and his emotions, and to give himself up to them passively. He loathed the idea of trying to answer the questions that would rise up in his heart and mind. "I am not to blame for all this," he thought to himself, half unconsciously. Towards 6 o'clock he found himself at the station of the Tsarskoye railway. He was tired of solitude now. A new rush of feeling took hold of him, and a flood of light chased away the gloom for a moment from his soul. He took a ticket to Pavlovsk and determined to get there as fast as he could, but something stopped him. A reality and not a fantasy, as he was inclined to think it. He was about to take his place in a carriage when he suddenly threw away his ticket and came out again, disturbed and thoughtful. A few moments later, in the street, he recalled something that had bothered him all the afternoon. He caught himself engaged in a strange occupation, which he now recollected he had taken up at odd moments for the last few hours. It was looking about all around him for something, he did not know what. He had forgotten it for a while, half an hour or so, and now, suddenly, the uneasy search had recommenced. But he had hardly become conscious of this curious phenomenon when another recollection suddenly swam through his brain, interesting him for the moment exceedingly. He remembered that the last time he had been engaged in looking around him for the unknown something, he was standing before a cutler's shop, in the window of which were exposed certain goods for sale. He was extremely anxious now to discover whether this shop and these goods really existed, or whether the whole thing had been a hallucination. He felt in a very curious condition today, a condition similar to that which had preceded his fits in bygone years. He remembered that at such times he had been particularly absent-minded, and could not discriminate between objects and persons unless he concentrated special attention upon them. He remembered seeing something in the window marked at 60 kopecks. Therefore, if the shop existed, and if this object were really in the window, it would prove that he had been able to concentrate his attention on this article at a moment when, as a general rule, his absence of mind would have been too great to admit of any such concentration. In fact, very shortly after he had left the railway station in such a state of agitation. So he walked back, looking about him for the shop, and his heart beat with intolerable impatience. Ah, here was the very shop, and there was the article marked 60 kop. Of course it's 60 kopecks, he thought, and certainly worth no more. This idea amused him, and he laughed. But it was a hysterical laugh. He was feeling terribly oppressed. He remembered clearly that just here, standing before this window, he had suddenly turned round, just as earlier in the day he had turned and found the dreadful eyes of Rogozhin fixed upon him. Convinced, therefore, that in this respect, at all events, he had been under no delusion, he left the shop and went on. This must be thought out. It was clear that there had been no hallucination at the station then either. Something had actually happened to him on both occasions. There was no doubt of it. But again a loathing for all mental exertion overmastered him. He would not think it out now. He would put it off and think of something else. He remembered that during his epileptic fits, or rather immediately preceding them, he had always experienced a moment or two when his whole heart and mind and body seemed to wake up to vigour and light, when he became filled with joy and hope, and all his anxieties seemed to be swept away for ever. These moments were but presentiments, as it were, of the one final second. It was never more than a second in which the fit came upon him. That second, of course, was inexpressible. When his attack was over and the prince reflected on his symptoms, he used to say to himself, "These moments, short as they are, when I feel such extreme consciousness of myself, and consequently more of life than at other times, are due only to the disease, to the sudden rupture of normal conditions. Therefore they are not really a higher kind of life, but a lower." This reasoning, however, seemed to end in a paradox, and lead to the further consideration: what matter though it be only disease, an abnormal tension of the brain, if when I recall and analyse the moment, it seems to have been one of harmony and beauty in the highest degree, an instant of deepest sensation, overflowing with unbounded joy and rapture, ecstatic devotion and completest life. Vague though this sounds, it was perfectly comprehensible to Myshkin, though he knew that it was but a feeble expression of his sensations. That there was indeed beauty and harmony in those abnormal moments, that they really contained the highest synthesis of life, he could not doubt, nor even admit the possibility of doubt. He felt that they were not analogous to the fantastic and unreal dreams due to intoxication by hashish, opium or wine. Of that he could judge when the attack was over. These instants were characterized, to define it in a word, by an intense quickening of the sense of personality. Since in the last conscious moment preceding the attack, he could say to himself, with full understanding of his words, "I would give my whole life for this one instant," then doubtless to him it really was worth a lifetime. For the rest, he thought the dialectical part of the argument of little worth. He saw only too clearly that the result of these ecstatic moments was stupefaction, mental darkness, idiocy. No argument was possible on that point. His conclusion, his estimate of the moment, doubtless contained some error, yet the reality of the sensation troubled him. What's more unanswerable than a fact? And this fact had occurred. The prince had confessed unreservedly to himself that the feeling of intense beatitude in that crowded moment made the moment worth a lifetime. "I feel then," he said one day to Rogozhin in Moscow, "I feel then as if I had understood those amazing words, 'There shall be no more time.'" And he added with a smile, "No doubt the epileptic Mohammed refers to that same moment when he says that he visited all the dwellings of Allah in less time than was needed to empty his pitcher of water." Yes, he had often met Rogozhin in Moscow, and many were the subjects they discussed. "He told me I had been a brother to him," thought the prince. "He said so today for the first time." He was sitting in the summer garden on a seat under a tree, and his mind dwelt on the matter. It was about 7 o'clock, and the place was empty. The stifling atmosphere foretold a storm, and the prince felt a certain charm in the contemplative mood which possessed him. He found pleasure, too, in gazing at the exterior objects around him. All the time he was trying to forget something, to escape from some idea that haunted him. But melancholy thoughts came back, though he would so willingly have escaped from them. He remembered suddenly how he had been talking to the waiter while he dined about a recently committed murder which the whole town was discussing, and as he thought of it, something strange came over him. He was seized all at once by a violent desire, almost a temptation, against which he strove in vain. He jumped up and walked off as fast as he could towards the Petersburg side. He had asked someone a little while before to show him which was the Petersburg side on the banks of the Neva. He had not gone there, however, and he knew very well that it was of no use to go now, for he would certainly not find Lebedeff's relation at home. He had the address, but she must certainly have gone to Pavlovsk, or Kolya would have let him know. If he were to go now, it would merely be out of curiosity. But a sudden new idea had come into his head. However, it was something to move on and know where he was going. A minute later he was still moving on, but without knowing anything. He could no longer think out his new idea. He tried to take an interest in all he saw, in the sky, in the Neva. He spoke to some children he met. He felt his epileptic condition becoming more and more developed. The evening was very close. Thunder was heard some way off. The prince was haunted all that day by the face of Lebedeff's nephew, whom he had seen for the first time that morning, just as one is haunted at times by some persistent musical refrain. By a curious association of ideas, the young man always appeared as the murderer of whom Lebedeff had spoken when introducing him to Myshkin. Yes, he had read something about the murder, and that quite recently. Since he came to Russia, he had heard many stories of this kind and was interested in them. His conversation with the waiter an hour ago chanced to be on the subject of this murder of the Zemarins, and the latter had agreed with him about it. He thought of the waiter again, and decided that he was no fool, but a steady, intelligent man. Though, said he to himself, God knows what he may really be. In a country with which one is unfamiliar, it is difficult to understand the people one meets. He was beginning to have a passionate faith in the Russian soul, however, and what discoveries he had made in the last 6 months, what unexpected discoveries. But every soul is a mystery, and depths of mystery lie in the soul of a Russian. He had been intimate with Rogozhin, for example, and a brotherly friendship had sprung up between them. Yet, did he really know him? What chaos and ugliness fills the world at times! What a self-satisfied rascal is that nephew of Lebedeff's! But what am I thinking? Continued the prince to himself. Can he really have committed that crime? Did he kill those 6 persons? I seem to be confusing things. How strange it all is. My head goes round. And Lebedeff's daughter, how sympathetic and charming her face was as she held the child in her arms. What an innocent look and childlike laugh she had. It is curious that I had forgotten her until now. I expect Lebedeff adores her, and I really believe, when I think of it, that as sure as 2 and 2 make 4, he is fond of that nephew too. Well, why should he judge them so hastily? Could he really say what they were after one short visit? Even Lebedeff seemed an enigma today. Did he expect to find him so? He had never seen him like that before, Lebedeff and the Comtesse du Barry. Good heavens! If Rogozhin should really kill someone, it would not at any rate be such a senseless, chaotic affair. A knife made to a special pattern, and 6 people killed in a kind of delirium. But Rogozhin also had a knife made to a special pattern. Can it be that Rogozhin wishes to murder anyone? The prince began to tremble violently. It is a crime on my part to imagine anything so base, with such cynical frankness. His face reddened with shame at the thought, and then there came across him, as in a flash, the memory of the incidents at the Pavlovsk station, and at the other station in the morning, and the question asked him by Rogozhin about the eyes, and Rogozhin's cross that he was even now wearing, and the benediction of Rogozhin's mother, and his embrace on the darkened staircase, that last supreme renunciation. And now to find himself full of this new idea, staring into shop windows and looking round for things. How base he was! Despair overmastered his soul. He would not go on. He would go back to his hotel. He even turned and went the other way. But a moment after, he changed his mind again and went on in the old direction. Why, here he was on the Petersburg side already, quite close to the house. Where was his idea? He was marching along without it now. Yes, his malady was coming back, it was clear enough. All this gloom and heaviness, all these ideas, were nothing more nor less than a fit coming on. Perhaps he would have a fit this very day. But just now all the gloom and darkness had fled. His heart felt full of joy and hope. There was no such thing as doubt. And yes, he hadn't seen her for so long. He really must see her. He wished he could meet Rogozhin. He would take his hand, and they would go to her together. His heart was pure. He was no rival of Parfen's. Tomorrow he would go and tell him that he had seen her. Why, he had only come for the sole purpose of seeing her, all the way from Moscow. Perhaps she might be here still, who knows? She might not have gone away to Pavlovsk yet. Yes, all this must be put straight and above board. There must be no more passionate renouncements, such as Rogozhin's. It must all be clear as day. Cannot Rogozhin's soul bear the light? He said he did not love her with sympathy and pity. True, he added that your pity is greater than my love. But he was not quite fair on himself there. Kin? Rogozhin reading a book, wasn't that sympathy beginning? Did it not show that he comprehended his relations with her? And his story of waiting day and night for her forgiveness, that didn't look quite like passion alone. And as to her face, could it inspire nothing but passion? Could her face inspire passion at all now? Oh, it inspired suffering, grief, overwhelming grief of the soul. A poignant, agonizing memory swept over the prince's heart. Yes, agonizing. He remembered how he had suffered that first day when he thought he observed in her the symptoms of madness. He had almost fallen into despair. How could he have lost his hold upon her when she ran away from him to Rogozhin? He ought to have run after her himself, rather than wait for news as he had done. Can Rogozhin have failed to observe up to now that she is mad? Rogozhin attributes her strangeness to other causes, to passion. What insane jealousy! What was it he had hinted at in that suggestion of his? The prince suddenly blushed and shuddered to his very heart. But why recall all this? There was insanity on both sides. For him, the prince, to love this woman with passion was unthinkable. It would be cruel and inhuman. Yes, Rogozhin is not fair to himself. He has a large heart. He has aptitude for sympathy. When he learns the truth, and finds what a pitiable being is this injured, broken, half-insane creature, he will forgive her all the torment she has caused him. He will become her slave, her brother, her friend. Compassion will teach even Rogozhin. It will show him how to reason. Compassion is the chief law of human existence. Oh, how guilty he felt towards Rogozhin, and for a few warm, hasty words spoken in Moscow, Parfen had called him brother, while he... But no, this was delirium. It would come all right. That gloomy Parfen had implied that his faith was waning. He must suffer dreadfully. He said he liked to look at that picture. It was not that he liked it, but he felt the need of looking at it. Rogozhin was not merely a passionate soul, he was a fighter. He was fighting for the restoration of his dying faith. He must have something to hold on to and believe, and someone to believe in. What a strange picture that of Holbein is. Why, this is the street, and here's the house, number 16. The prince rang the bell and asked for Nastasya Filippovna. The lady of the house came out and stated that Nastasya had gone to stay with Daria Alexeyevna at Pavlovsk and might be there some days. Madame Filisov was a little woman of 40, with a cunning face and crafty, piercing eyes. When, with an air of mystery, she asked her visitor's name, he refused at first to answer, but in a moment he changed his mind, and left strict instructions that it should be given to Nastasya Filippovna. The urgency of his request seemed to impress Madame Filisov, and she put on a knowing expression, as if to say, "You need not be afraid, I quite understand." The prince's name evidently was a great surprise to her. He stood and looked absently at her for a moment, then turned, and took the road back to his hotel. But he went away not as he came. A great change had suddenly come over him. He went blindly forward. His knees shook under him. He was tormented by ideas. His lips were blue and trembled with a feeble, meaningless smile. His demon was upon him once more. What had happened to him? Why was his brow clammy with drops of moisture, his knees shaking beneath him, and his soul oppressed with a cold gloom? Was it because he had just seen those dreadful eyes again? Why, he had left the summer garden on purpose to see them. That had been his idea. He had wished to assure himself that he would see them once more at that house. Then why was he so overwhelmed now, having seen them as he expected? Just as though he had not expected to see them. Yes, they were the very same eyes, and no doubt about it. The same that he had seen in the crowd that morning at the station. The same that he had surprised in Rogozhin's rooms some hours later, when the latter had replied to his inquiry with a sneering laugh. "Well, whose eyes were they?" Then for the third time they had appeared just as he was getting into the train on his way to see Aglaya. He had had a strong impulse to rush up to Rogozhin and repeat his words of the morning. "Whose eyes are they?" Instead, he had fled from the station and knew nothing more until he found himself gazing into the window of a cutler's shop and wondering if a knife with a staghorn handle would cost more than 60 kopecks. And as the prince sat dreaming in the summer garden under a lime tree, a wicked demon had come and whispered in his ear, "Rogozhin has been spying upon you and watching you all the morning in a frenzy of desperation. When he finds you have not gone to Pavlovsk, a terrible discovery for him, he will surely go at once to that house in Petersburg Side and watch for you there, although only this morning you gave your word of honour not to see her, and swore that you had not come to Petersburg for that purpose. And thereupon the prince had hastened off to that house, and what was there in the fact that he had met Rogozhin there? He had only seen a wretched, suffering creature, whose state of mind was gloomy and miserable, but most comprehensible. In the morning Rogozhin had seemed to be trying to keep out of the way, but at the station this afternoon he had stood out. He had concealed himself, indeed, less than the prince himself. At the house now he had stood 50 yards off on the other side of the road, with folded hands, watching, plainly in view, and apparently desirous of being seen. He had stood there like an accuser, like a judge, not like a what? And why had not the prince approached him and spoken to him, instead of turning away and pretending he had seen nothing, although their eyes met? Yes, their eyes had met, and they had looked at each other. Why, he had himself wished to take Rogozhin by the hand and go in together. He had himself determined to go to him on the morrow and to tell him that he had seen her. He had repudiated the demon as he walked to the house, and his heart had been full of joy. Was there something in the whole aspect of the man today sufficient to justify the prince's terror and the awful suspicions of his demon? Something seen but indescribable, which filled him with dreadful presentiments. Yes, he was convinced of it. Convinced of what? Oh, how mean and hideous of him to feel this conviction, this presentiment. How he blamed himself for it. Speak, if you dare, and tell me, what is the presentiment? He repeated to himself over and over again. Put it into words. Speak out clearly and distinctly. Oh, miserable coward that I am! The prince flushed with shame for his own baseness. How shall I ever look this man in the face again? My God, what a day! And what a nightmare! What a nightmare! There was a moment during this long, wretched walk back from the Petersburg side when the prince felt an irresistible desire to go straight to Rogozhin's, wait for him, embrace him with tears of shame and contrition, and tell him of his distrust, and finish with it, once for all. But here he was, back at his hotel. How often during the day he had thought of this hotel with loathing, its corridor, its rooms, its stairs. How he had dreaded coming back to it for some reason. What a regular old woman I am today, he had said to himself each time with annoyance. I believe in every foolish presentiment that comes into my head. He stopped for a moment at the door. A great flush of shame came over him. I am a coward, a wretched coward, he said, and moved forward again. But once more he paused. Among all the incidents of the day, one recurred to his mind to the exclusion of the rest. Although now that his self-control was regained, and he was no longer under the influence of a nightmare, he was able to think of it calmly. It concerned the knife on Rogozhin's table. Why should not Rogozhin have as many knives on his table as he chooses? Thought the prince, wondering at his suspicions, as he had done when he found himself looking into the cutler's window. What could it have to do with me? He said to himself again, and stopped as if rooted to the ground by a kind of paralysis of limb, such as attacks people under the stress of some humiliating recollection. The doorway was dark and gloomy at any time, but just at this moment it was rendered doubly so by the fact that the thunderstorm had just broken and the rain was coming down in torrents. And in the semi-darkness the prince distinguished a man standing close to the stairs, apparently waiting. There was nothing particularly significant in the fact that a man was standing back in the doorway, waiting to come out or go upstairs, but the prince felt an irresistible conviction that he knew this man, and that it was Rogozhin. The man moved on up the stairs. A moment later the prince passed up them too. His heart froze within him. In a minute or two I shall know all, he thought. The staircase led to the first and second corridors of the hotel, along which lay the guests' bedrooms. As is often the case in Petersburg houses, it was narrow and very dark, and turned around a massive stone column. On the first landing, which was as small as the necessary turn of the stairs allowed, there was a niche in the column, about half a yard wide, and in this niche the prince felt convinced that a man stood concealed. He thought he could distinguish a figure standing there. He would pass by quickly and not look. He took a step forward, but could bear the uncertainty no longer and turned his head. The eyes, the same two eyes, met his. The man concealed in the niche had also taken a step forward. For 1 second they stood face to face. Suddenly the prince caught the man by the shoulder and twisted him round towards the light, so that he might see his face more clearly. Rogozhin's eyes flashed, and a smile of insanity distorted his countenance. His right hand was raised, and something glittered in it. The prince did not think of trying to stop it. All he could remember afterwards was that he seemed to have called out, "Parfen, I won't believe it!" Next moment something appeared to burst open before him. A wonderful inner light illuminated his soul. This lasted perhaps half a second, yet he distinctly remembered hearing the beginning of the wail, the strange, dreadful wail, which burst from his lips of its own accord, and which no effort of will on his part could suppress. Next moment he was absolutely unconscious. Black darkness blotted out everything. He had fallen in an epileptic fit. As is well known, these fits occur instantaneously. The face, especially the eyes, become terribly disfigured. Convulsions seize the limbs. A terrible cry breaks from the sufferer. A wail from which everything human seems to be blotted out, so that it is impossible to believe that the man who has just fallen is the same who emitted the dreadful cry. It seems more as though some other being inside the stricken one had cried. Many people have borne witness to this impression, and many cannot behold an epileptic fit without a feeling of mysterious terror and dread. Such a feeling, we must suppose, overtook Rogozhin at this moment and saved the prince's life. Not knowing that it was a fit, and seeing his victim disappear head foremost into the darkness, hearing his head strike the stone steps below with a crash, Rogozhin rushed downstairs, skirting the body, and flung himself headlong out of the hotel, like a raving madman. The prince's body slipped convulsively down the steps till it rested at the bottom. Very soon, in 5 minutes or so, he was discovered, and a crowd collected around him. A pool of blood on the steps near his head gave rise to grave fears. Was it a case of accident, or had there been a crime? It was, however, soon recognized as a case of epilepsy, and identification and proper measures for restoration followed one another, owing to a fortunate circumstance. Colia Ivolgin had come back to his hotel about 7 o'clock, owing to a sudden impulse which made him refuse to dine at the Epanchins', and, finding a note from the prince awaiting him, had sped away to the latter's address. Arrived there, he ordered a cup of tea and sat sipping it in the coffee-room. While there, he heard excited whispers of someone just found at the bottom of the stairs in a fit, upon which he had hurried to the spot with a presentiment of evil, and at once recognized the prince. The sufferer was immediately taken to his room, and though he partially regained consciousness, he lay long in a semi-dazed condition. The doctor stated that there was no danger to be apprehended from the wound on the head, and as soon as the prince could understand what was going on around him, Colia hired a carriage and took him away to Lebedeff's. There he was received with much cordiality, and the departure to the country was hastened on his account. 3 days later, they were all at Pavlovsk. End of Part 2, Chapter 5.